They said a man who never smiled had already stopped being human. But in the glass tower overlooking Manhattan, William Carter proved something worse. He had simply forgotten how. At 38, he was the youngest billionaire CEO in the city's elite circle, a name printed on buildings, contracts, and headlines. Yet none of it reached him anymore. As he stood in a boardroom filled with celebrating executives and rising stock charts glowing on a screen, his expression remained unchanged, unreadable, almost absent, like he was watching someone else's success instead of his own. No applause touched him, no victory settled in his chest. And when someone quietly remarked that the company had just broken its highest quarterly record, William only nodded once, as if acknowledging weather rather than achievement. Across the city, inside a quieter floor of the same corporation, Emily Harper adjusted stacks of documents with careful precision, a young assistant known for her efficiency but not for her silence. Because Emily was never truly silent when she thought she was alone. Under her breath, she would whisper instructions to herself, soft encouragements meant to steady her hands and calm her thoughts. "You're okay, Emily, just breathe. One step at a time," she would say while organizing schedules or fixing minor mistakes no one else noticed, as if another version of herself was always listening back. Most people found it odd, some even avoided comment, but Emily had long stopped caring how it looked, because talking to herself was how she stayed grounded, how she kept the weight of exhaustion from pressing too hard on her shoulders, especially when hospital bills waited at home and every paycheck already had a destination before it arrived. That afternoon, while the building settled into its usual rhythm of keyboards and footsteps, William walked past the administrative corridor for reasons even he didn't question, and that was when he heard it, a voice, soft but steady, speaking into empty air with a strange kind of warmth. "It's fine. You can handle this. Just finish one task at a time," Emily murmured to herself while reviewing files, her brow slightly furrowed. Her tone not dramatic, not attention-seeking, just quietly human in a way that felt unfamiliar in a place built on control and ambition. William slowed without realizing it, his gaze shifting toward the glass wall where she stood, unaware of him, unaware of anything beyond her own internal conversation, and for a moment he simply watched, not because she was unusual in appearance or action, but because there was something steady in her fragility, something that did not collapse under pressure but spoke through it instead. He should have kept walking, he usually did, but instead he paused longer than necessary, as if his mind had failed to give the usual command to move on, and Emily, still lost in her quiet self-assurance, added gently, "You're stronger than you think, don't mess this up now," while straightening the last file on her desk, completely unaware that the most emotionless man in the building had stopped outside her door and was hearing every word she never intended for anyone else to hear. William Carter did not move at first, not because he was surprised, but because surprise had stopped being part of his emotional vocabulary years ago. Yet something about what he had just heard held him in place longer than usual, like a faint interruption in a system that was designed to run without errors or hesitation. Through the glass wall he could still see her, Emily Harper, focused on her work again as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just spoken to herself with a kind of gentle conviction that sounded more real than most of the conversations he had heard in boardrooms for the past decade. He watched her for a few more seconds, then turned away as if nothing had occurred, continuing down the corridor with steady steps, his face unchanged, his presence still cold enough to make passing employees lower their eyes. But for the rest of the afternoon, something small and unfamiliar stayed with him, not a thought exactly, more like an echo of a voice that did not belong in his world. Emily, meanwhile, remained unaware of any of it, finishing her tasks with quiet discipline, occasionally pausing to whisper brief reassurances to herself whenever pressure built too tightly in her chest, especially when reminders of overdue hospital statements flashed on her phone screen during breaks she did not truly take. By late evening, most of the floor had emptied, leaving only the hum of distant equipment and the soft glow of desk lamps scattered across rows of silent workstations. And it was then that Emily stayed behind to complete a final set of reports William had requested earlier that day. She rolled her shoulders gently, exhaled slowly, and spoke under her breath again. "Almost done. Emily, just finish this and you can go home." Her voice barely above a whisper, yet steady enough to keep her moving. Unknown to her, William had returned to the same corridor, not because he needed anything specific, but because he found himself walking there without clear intention, as if his routine had subtly shifted around something he did not yet understand. He stopped again near the glass wall, watching her work, noticing the way she paused occasionally to steady herself, noticing how she did not look for validation outside of her own quiet encouragement, and for reasons he could not define. That simplicity felt more structured than the carefully built confidence of the executives he met daily. After several moments, Emily finally leaned back slightly in her chair, closing her eyes for a brief second, and in that silence she let out a soft murmur. "You are doing enough, even if it does not feel like it." Words meant only for herself, words she never expected anyone else to hear, but William heard them clearly, and this time he did not immediately walk away. Instead, he stood there longer than before, as if trying to understand something that had no place in spreadsheets or financial forecasts, something that felt uncomfortably human. The following morning, the city moved with its usual urgency, elevators rising and falling like quiet pulses inside the glass tower. But William Carter arrived earlier than usual, which alone was enough for his executive assistant to notice something was different, although she did not dare ask. He walked straight past his office, past the meeting room where a scheduled briefing was already being prepared, and instead stopped near the administrative corridor where Emily Harper worked. She was not aware of him yet, seated behind her desk with a focused expression, typing carefully while occasionally pausing to quietly rehearse thoughts under her breath, as if speaking to someone only she could hear. "Stay calm. Just finish the financial summary. Then review the emails," she whispered softly to herself, her tone steady but slightly tired, revealing a kind of endurance that did not seek attention but simply persisted. William stood there longer than he intended, observing without interruption, and for the first time in years he felt something unusual, not curiosity in the professional sense, but a quiet discomfort that came from recognizing something unfamiliar in another person. He noticed how she did not perform confidence for others, how she built it internally word by word, breath by breath, as if survival depended on it more than success ever could. After a few moments, Emily finally sensed presence and looked up, immediately straightening in her chair when she saw him standing there, her expression shifting into professional alertness. "Good morning, sir," she said quickly, reaching for her tablet, trying to hide any sign of distraction. William simply nodded once, his expression unchanged, and after a brief silence he spoke in a calm voice. "You were still here late last night." It was not a question, and it was not a criticism, but it made Emily hesitate for a fraction of a second before answering. "I had to finish the reports," she said politely, though there was a slight fatigue behind her words that she tried to keep invisible. William glanced at the documents on her desk, then back at her, as if measuring something beyond productivity, something less tangible. "You talk to yourself," he said suddenly, not accusing, not mocking, simply observing. The words landed in the space between them, and Emily froze for a moment, her fingers tightening slightly around her tablet. She had never been directly called out for it before, and for a brief second she considered denying it, but something in his tone did not invite defense, only honesty. "Yes," she admitted quietly, her eyes lowering slightly. "It helps me stay focused." There was another pause, longer this time, and William looked away toward the window as if processing something he did not yet understand, the city stretching far beyond the glass like a world he controlled but did not feel part of. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before. "And what do you tell yourself when it is difficult?" Emily hesitated, caught between professionalism and something more personal she rarely allowed to surface in a workplace. Finally she answered, almost inaudibly, "That I am still enough, even when I do not feel like it." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that lingered in the air after she said them, and William did not respond immediately, as if the answer had reached a place in him that had long been closed off. Instead, he simply stood there for a moment longer, then turned slightly as though to leave, but something in his expression had shifted, subtle and unreadable, like a door that had not opened but was no longer fully sealed. For the rest of that morning, William Carter did not return to his usual rhythm of back-to-back meetings and carefully controlled decisions. Instead, he remained unusually still within his office, seated behind the large glass desk overlooking Manhattan, as if the city outside had temporarily lost its usual grip on him. His assistant entered twice with urgent schedules and pending approvals, and both times he responded with brief acknowledgement without looking away from the window for long, which was enough to signal that his attention was not where it was expected to be. Meanwhile, on the lower floor, Emily Harper continued her work unaware of the quiet shift forming above her, typing reports and responding to emails while occasionally whispering under her breath in the same steady rhythm she always used. One step at a time. Just finish this section. You are fine. Her voice soft enough to disappear into the hum of office equipment, yet consistent enough to keep her anchored. William eventually stood from his desk and moved again toward the administrative corridor, not because of obligation, but because something about that space now pulled at his attention in a way he did not fully understand. When he arrived, Emily was speaking quietly to herself again, this time reviewing a difficult client summary, her expression slightly tense but controlled, and as she paused she whispered, "Do not panic. You have handled worse than this," almost as if reminding herself of survival rather than success. William stopped just outside the glass partition, watching her without announcing his presence, and for a moment he noticed something different from the previous encounters, not just vulnerability but structure, as if her words were forming a system that held her together when nothing else did. After several seconds, he stepped forward, and the subtle sound of his movement caused Emily to look up again, quickly adjusting her posture as she realized he was there, her professional composure returning immediately. "Sir," she said carefully, "is there something you need?" William did not answer right away. Instead, his eyes briefly scanned the documents on her desk before returning to her face, as if searching for something unspoken. "You repeat yourself when you work under pressure," he said calmly, not as criticism, but as observation. Emily hesitated, unsure how to respond to a statement that felt too personal for a workplace exchange, but she answered honestly after a brief pause. "It helps me stay organized. I think better when I say things out loud." There was a silence that followed, longer than either of them usually allowed in professional conversation, and during that silence William noticed something else, the slight tremor of exhaustion in her hands that she quickly concealed by adjusting a folder. Without fully intending to, he asked another question, quieter this time. "Do you ever stop?" Emily gave a small, almost apologetic smile, her eyes lowering briefly before she replied, "Not really, but I cannot afford to lose focus." That answer lingered longer than expected, and William found himself studying her not as an employee, but as a pattern he could not easily categorize, because everything about her suggested pressure without collapse, struggle without surrender. After a moment, he finally turned slightly as if preparing to leave, but paused again, his voice lower than before. "That is not the same as being okay." Emily looked up at him then, surprised by the observation, but before she could respond, he had already begun to walk away, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before, heavier in a way neither of them yet understood. That evening, the building had already shifted into its quieter rhythm, where lights dimmed one by one, and the constant movement of ambition softened into scattered footsteps and closing doors. Yet Emily Harper remained at her desk longer than most, finishing final adjustments to a financial summary that had been returned with additional notes marked in red. Her shoulders carried a subtle weight of fatigue, but her focus did not break, and every few minutes she would pause just long enough to whisper to herself, "Almost done. Just one more section. You can rest after this." Her voice steady but carrying the quiet persistence of someone who had learned to function through exhaustion rather than wait for relief. Above her, in the executive level, William Carter stood near the window again, but this time he was not looking at the city in the usual distant way. Instead, his attention kept drifting back toward the lower floors, as if something there had become difficult to ignore. He had already reviewed reports twice without absorbing them, and for the first time in years he found his concentration slipping not because of external disruption, but because of something internal he could not categorize. Eventually, without announcing it to anyone, he left his office and walked down toward the administrative section, his steps controlled but less mechanical than usual, as if he was following a thought that had not yet fully formed into intention. When he arrived, Emily was alone in the office area, most of her colleagues already gone, and she was speaking softly to herself again while reviewing figures on her screen. Stay calm. This is just data. You understand this. You are not overwhelmed, she whispered, gently pressing her fingers against the edge of her desk as though grounding herself physically to match her thoughts. William stopped at a distance where he would not immediately be noticed, watching her with an expression that remained composed but slightly more focused than before, as if he was trying to understand not her actions alone, but the necessity behind them. After a moment, Emily exhaled slowly and leaned back in her chair, briefly closing her eyes. And in that quiet moment, she said something softer, almost fragile in its honesty. You are allowed to be tired, but you are not allowed to give up. Words that seemed directed at herself but carried a weight that filled the silence around her. William stepped forward then, not abruptly, but enough for her to notice, and Emily quickly opened her eyes and straightened her posture, immediately returning to professional composure despite the fatigue still visible in her expression. I did not realize anyone was still here, she said carefully, her tone polite but slightly cautious. William looked at her for a moment before responding, his voice even and controlled. You stay later than everyone else. It was not a question and not judgment, simply acknowledgement, and Emily nodded slightly, as if unsure whether that required explanation. There is always more to finish, she replied simply, as though it was the only logical answer. William's gaze shifted briefly toward the documents on her desk, then back to her face, and after a short pause he asked, Why do you speak to yourself? Emily hesitated, caught between instinctive embarrassment and honesty, but something in his tone did not feel intrusive, only observant, so she answered, It helps me stay steady. When everything feels like too much, it keeps me from freezing. There was a long silence after that, and for the first time William did not immediately leave it. Instead, he remained still, as if processing a concept that did not belong in the structured world he understood, where systems either worked or failed, but did not quietly hold someone together in between. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, almost thoughtful. And does it work? Emily gave a small, uncertain nod. It keeps me going. That answer seemed to stay with him longer than anything else had that day. And when he finally turned to leave, his steps were slower than before, as if something within his controlled world had shifted just slightly, not enough to break it, but enough that he could no longer pretend it had not been touched. The following morning arrived with a quieter kind of tension inside the glass tower, not the loud urgency of deadlines or meetings, but something subtler that seemed to sit beneath every movement, as if the building itself had begun to register an unseen shift. William Carter entered earlier than usual again, passing through the security gates without greeting anyone, his expression controlled as always, yet his focus already drifting toward a part of the building he had begun to notice more than he intended. He did not go directly to his office. Instead, he paused near the corridor leading to the administrative floor, standing still for a moment longer than what could be considered routine, as if waiting for something he would not openly admit he was waiting for. Below, Emily Harper had already started her day, her desk neatly organized, her posture slightly forward as she reviewed updated files, and as usual she spoke softly to herself under her breath. Stay focused. Just finish the client notes first, then you can handle the rest. Her voice steady but carrying a faint trace of fatigue that had become part of her daily rhythm. William eventually moved again, walking down the corridor without announcement, his steps measured but no longer entirely detached, and when he reached the glass partition, he stopped as he had done before, observing her quietly without interruption. Emily did not notice him at first, continuing to work while occasionally pausing to adjust her thoughts aloud in small fragments. You are doing fine, just do not rush. Accuracy matters more than speed, she whispered, almost mechanically, as if reinforcing structure within herself through language. William watched this carefully, noticing not only the repetition but the consistency, how each phrase seemed to stabilize her rather than distract her, and for reasons he could not define, it felt more effective than many of the leadership strategies he had seen in high-level environments. After a few moments, Emily sensed presence again and looked up, her expression shifting quickly into professionalism when she saw him standing there. Good morning, sir, she said immediately, sitting straighter as her hands moved away from the keyboard. William gave a small nod, then stepped closer, not entering her personal space, but reducing the distance between observation and interaction. "You speak to yourself less when I am near," he said calmly, not as judgment, but as observation of a pattern. Emily paused, slightly caught off guard, then answered carefully, "It is not intentional. I just try to stay more focused when others are around." William studied her for a brief moment. Then his eyes shifted to the documents on her desk, noticing the detailed annotations, the organized structure, the precision that seemed to coexist with visible exhaustion. After a short silence, he asked, "Does it ever become too much?" The question was simple, but it landed differently than expected, and Emily hesitated before responding, her voice quieter now. "Sometimes, but I am used to managing it." There was another pause, longer than usual, and William did not immediately turn away. Instead, he remained where he was, as if the answer had introduced a variable he had not accounted for. Emily returned her attention to her screen, but something about the interaction lingered, an awareness that felt slightly different from previous encounters, as if the space between them had become less transactional and more uncertain. William finally stepped back, his expression still controlled, but his attention no longer fully detached, and as he turned to leave, he spoke one final sentence without looking at her. "Being used to something does not mean it is sustainable." Then he walked away, leaving Emily still seated at her desk, quietly processing words that had not been framed as advice, yet somehow remained longer than any instruction she had received in years. For the first time since he had taken notice of her, William Carter found himself arriving at the office with a sense of expectation he could not fully justify, as if something unresolved was quietly waiting for him somewhere between the glass walls and silent corridors of the building. Emily Harper, however, began her day like every other, unaware of any shift in attention above her world, her desk already covered in updated reports and urgent requests marked with tight deadlines, her fingers moving steadily across the keyboard while she quietly repeated to herself, "Stay ahead. Do not fall behind. Just finish what is in front of you." Her voice barely audible, but constant enough to anchor her focus. What she did not notice was that her workload had subtly increased overnight, additional files assigned without explanation, a pattern that would normally be distributed among 3 assistants now consolidated onto her desk, a quiet pressure that had no face but carried clear consequences. By mid-morning, her movements became slightly slower, her pauses between tasks a little longer, though she continued her internal dialogue with the same controlled persistence. "You can handle this. Just do not stop now." "Not yet," she whispered as she adjusted another set of documents, refusing to acknowledge how quickly time was slipping away from her. William observed from a distance without interruption, noticing the change before anyone else seemed to register it. The way her composure remained intact but thinner than before, like something stretched too far but still refusing to break. At one point, an executive assistant nearby commented casually that Emily had requested no help despite the volume of work, framing it as efficiency, but William did not respond, his attention fixed instead on the subtle signs of strain that others overlooked. Later that afternoon, Emily received a sudden request from upper management to revise a full financial presentation within an unreasonably short time frame. And though she hesitated for only a moment, she still nodded and accepted without protest, her instinct not to refuse but to adapt. As she worked, her internal voice became slightly more fragile. "Just keep going. Do not think about how much is left. Only what you can finish now," she murmured under her breath, her fingers pressing harder against the keyboard as if physical pressure could compensate for mental exhaustion. William finally moved from his position and approached the glass partition again, this time not stopping at a distance, but stepping closer until he was visible within her peripheral vision. Emily noticed him and quickly adjusted her posture, attempting to mask fatigue behind professionalism. But for the first time, William did not immediately speak. Instead, he looked at the documents scattered across her desk, then at her face, and after a long pause he said in a controlled but lower tone, "This workload was not assigned evenly." Emily hesitated, then replied carefully, "It is fine. I can complete it." But there was a slight delay in her voice that contradicted her words, a gap William did not ignore. He studied her for a moment longer before responding. "You are not required to complete everything alone. The statement hung in the air longer than expected, and Emily lowered her gaze briefly, not out of disagreement, but out of habit, as if accepting help was a concept she had never fully allowed herself to consider. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, and in that silence William's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not into emotion, but into recognition that something within the structure he understood was beginning to fail in a way he could no longer overlook. The silence that followed William Carter's last statement did not feel like an ending, but rather like a pause inside a system that had begun to behave differently than it was designed to. Emily Harper remained seated at her desk, her eyes briefly lowered toward the documents in front of her, though her attention was no longer fully on the text. Instead, it lingered on the words he had just spoken, repeating softly in her mind without permission, "You are not required to complete everything alone." She had heard variations of instructions before, deadlines, expectations, corrections, but never something that questioned the necessity of her isolation. William, on the other hand, had already turned slightly away, yet he did not leave immediately, his presence still anchored near the glass partition as if something unresolved kept him from returning to his usual rhythm. After a few seconds, he spoke again, this time without looking directly at her. "Take a break." The words were simple, almost procedural in tone, but they did not belong to his usual communication style, and even he seemed aware of that subtle inconsistency. Emily hesitated, then responded carefully, "I will finish the current section first." It was not refusal in the traditional sense, but habit, the kind of answer given by someone who had never been trained to stop without justification. William finally turned back toward her, his expression unchanged but his focus sharper than before. "The section will still exist in 10 minutes, he said evenly. "Your limits will not." That statement created a pause between them that felt longer than it should have, and Emily's fingers slowly left the keyboard, resting lightly on the edge of the desk, as if unsure whether stillness was permitted. For a moment, she seemed caught between two instincts, one that demanded continuation and another that had been rarely acknowledged, permission to pause. Eventually, she exhaled softly and nodded once, not in full acceptance, but in partial surrender to something unfamiliar. William observed this without comment, then gestured subtly toward the hallway outside the office area, not as an order, but as direction. "There is a quiet lounge 2 floors down," he said. "Go there." Emily stood slowly, gathering only a few necessary documents before leaving her workstation, her steps measured but uncertain, as if stepping outside her routine carried more weight than expected. William watched her disappear into the corridor before finally moving back toward the elevator. But instead of returning to his office, he stopped halfway, his reflection briefly visible in the polished metal doors. For a moment, he did not recognize what he was observing, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was unfamiliar within himself, the decision to interrupt efficiency for something that could not be quantified. Meanwhile, Emily reached the lounge, a quiet space overlooking the city from a lower angle, where the noise of work faded into distant movement. She sat down slowly, placing her hands on the table in front of her, and after a few seconds, she whispered without realizing it, "I did not know stopping could feel like this," her voice barely audible, as if testing a concept she had never been allowed to experience fully. Back in the corridor, William remained still for a long moment, his expression unchanged, but something within his perception of routine had already shifted, not dramatically, but enough that it could no longer be ignored. The city outside the glass tower continued its endless motion, unaware of the quiet change that had begun inside the building itself, where routines that once felt absolute were now subtly shifting around a presence no one could fully explain. In the executive level, William Carter stood alone near the window, no longer reviewing documents, no longer answering calls, simply observing the skyline as if it had taken on a different meaning than it held before. Emily Harper remained in the lounge 2 floors below, seated by the window where natural light softened the edges of the room, her posture still slightly tense from habit, though her breathing had slowed in a way she did not immediately trust. For a few minutes, she simply sat in silence, her hands resting on the table, and then without intending to, she whispered softly to herself, "It is okay to pause, just for a moment." But this time the words did not carry urgency, only uncertainty. Back upstairs, William finally moved from the window and returned to the corridor, not because he had a destination, but because staying still felt less consistent than movement, and he found himself stopping again near the elevator that would take him down 2 floors. When the doors opened, he stepped inside alone, pressing the button without hesitation, though he could not define what he expected to find. Emily was still in the lounge when she noticed movement at the entrance, and when she looked up, she saw him standing there again, this time without the separation of glass or distance, simply present in the same quiet space. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them felt different from the structured silence of the office, less controlled, more uncertain. William broke it first, his voice calm but lower than usual. "You did not return to your desk." Emily nodded slightly, then replied, "I was told to take a break." There was a brief pause before she added, almost cautiously, "It feels unfamiliar." William stepped further into the room but did not sit, instead remaining near the edge of the seating area, as if unsure where he was expected to place himself in a space that did not operate on hierarchy. "Unfamiliar is not the same as unnecessary," he said after a moment, his tone measured but no longer purely detached. Emily looked at him then, not as an assistant addressing a CEO, but as someone trying to understand a statement that did not belong to any instruction manual she had ever followed. "I am not used to being told that," she admitted quietly. William did not respond immediately, and in that pause something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not into warmth, but into recognition of distance he had never measured before. He finally spoke again. "You should not need permission to stop when you are exhausted." The words were simple, yet they lingered in the air longer than expected, and Emily lowered her gaze briefly, as if the concept itself required recalibration. Outside the lounge window, the city continued its steady pace, but inside the room, something had paused without breaking, and for the first time William Carter did not leave immediately after speaking. Instead, he remained standing there, as if the silence between them had become something he was no longer willing to ignore.